Can page builders make good websites? I didn't think so, until I saw this video by Anna Hickman about Framer. It wasn't clunky like other page builders I've used in the past, and I was very intrigued at how it seemed to combine design and development into one. Could Framer be the platform that changes my mind about drag and drop tools? I wanted to find out. So in this video, I built this front-end mentor challenge in Framer, all the way from a top navigation down to the footer. Each section posed a unique challenge, some of them trickier than others, and you'll see why I think CSS is still a useful skill to learn even when you have these tools. And just so you know, this video is not sponsored by Framer, but it is sponsored by me. We may be diving into a page builder, but if you do want to learn how to build a front-end website from scratch, check out my new course, Responsive Design for Beginners. It's on sale through the end of the summer, link is down below. Alright, let's get into Framer. To start off, I was pretty happy to see that Framer has a free plan, so you can sign up and try it out without needing to put in a credit card. Once I created my account, I was able to start a new project. At this point, I had watched a few Framer tutorials on YouTube, so I jumped in and started looking around. My first impressions of Framer were that it looked nice, the UI was well designed, and I loved that dark theme. There were a lot of items in the left sidebar, but they seemed well organized and it didn't feel overwhelming. The first thing I needed to build was a top navigation with links on desktop, and then a hamburger menu for tablet and mobile. So I checked out these pre-made navigation components, and this dark top nav seemed like it would be a good starting point. Not too bad. Another interesting feature I found was that you can add different versions of the website for different devices. Framer calls these breakpoints, and I added one for tablet and one for phone. The next step was to start making the navigation look more like the Figma design. I tried dragging the logo image from my files to the component like I'd seen in some tutorials, but I didn't realize that you can't edit a component from the main website view. You have to double-click the component, which will bring you to the component view, where you'll be able to see the whole thing and edit it there. Here, I was able to delete the original logo and add the new one in, and I can move it to the left side by reordering it in the layers. After updating the text links and adding the shopping cart, I stumbled upon a really neat feature. Framer uses both Flexbox and Grid to let you lay out elements in your web page. If you set an element, like the main desktop component, to be a stack layout, that turns it into a Flexbox parent. Then you have a bunch of controls which each correspond to a Flexbox-related CSS property. We have direction, which is flex direction, distribute, which is justify content, and I set it to space between, align, which is align items, and wrap, which is flex wrap, and you can add padding as well. The fact that Framer has basically created this GUI for adding CSS style rules is pretty freaking cool. Unfortunately, seeing all these familiar Flexbox rules gave me a false sense of confidence in my own Framer skills. I began just assuming that because I knew CSS and I saw some CSS controls in Framer, that it would be a cakewalk to figure out how to do everything else. But as you'll see very soon, I was in for a rude awakening. I started running into problems when I began trying to size the top nav bar. I started adding padding to the top nav on desktop, but there were two things I didn't realize. One was that Framer will often default to having a fixed pixel height on elements, and the main components for desktop and phone had a fixed height. Second, I didn't realize that when I added the padding on desktop, Framer would automatically sync that padding onto the phone version. So that, combined with a fixed height, made the logo get pushed down on the phone variant. I didn't know what was causing this, so I started just trying random settings in Framer, hoping that one of them would magically fix the problem. This is a kind of tunnel vision that I think happens to developers, including myself, when we're not familiar with something and we're trying to fix some bug and starting to get frustrated. What you should do is take a step back and try to get perspective on what the root cause of the bug is so you can figure out a solution. But instead, because you just want to get it working, you start throwing things against the wall without fully thinking everything through. This is not a good frame of mind to get into because you can't fix something if you don't understand it. I did finally manage to get the logo sort of centered by tweaking the align setting, which controls align items. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than it was before. So I decided to switch gears for a little bit and worked on getting the hamburger icon to match the design, which was a nice distraction, and I did feel like I was accomplishing something. And taking that little break actually did me good, because after that, I did manage to wrangle the vertical alignment by setting a fixed height of 90 pixels. So after that, I decided to move on to what I hoped was going to be an easier change to make, making the text links all uppercase. Simple, right? However, I couldn't for the life of me figure out where to set text transform uppercase. I did a search on uppercase text in Framer, hoping that a link to their documentation would be the first result. And I did find this help article. Unfortunately, their help articles only contain very broad, general descriptions of what you can do, which honestly are not helpful at all when you're looking for something really specific. That is a little annoying. But they do have a Reddit bot on rFramer that apparently will give decently detailed answers if you post a question on that sub, so I guess that's something. Anyway, after some more searching around Framer, I did manage to find the correct control setting and successfully got the text to turn uppercase. Oh my gosh. Okay, uppercase. Yes! I can't remember the last time I got this excited about making text all caps. Having solved the mystery of uppercase text, next, I tried to tackle the bigger problem that I had, which was that the pre-made navigation component only had desktop and phone variants, and I also wanted the tablet to display the mobile design. Framer is pretty cool in that you can create different breakpoints in the design for desktop, tablet, and phone, and it'll sync your content and styles across the different versions. By default, the desktop breakpoint is considered the primary one, so if you make a change on desktop, it'll sync down to tablet and mobile automatically, which does save some time. However, what I didn't know is that in order to keep all the breakpoint versions of the website in sync, it needs all the elements in your layers to be exactly the same across all breakpoints. That means that if I delete an element in tablet or phone, they won't actually disappear, but they simply get grayed out and hidden on the site because the element hasn't been deleted on desktop. And if I make a change in the layers on one of the breakpoints, like adding a group of layers to a new stack, that change will immediately get mirrored onto all the other versions. Oh my gosh. So when I made a new stack in the tablet version, I was unknowingly messing up how things looked in the desktop version. Logo's in the middle, so we need to move this icon before the logo. Everything else looks okay. Wait, why is this? And this was making me feel rather frustrated. Thankfully, I did finally realize what was going on, because I think I'm making changes in one part and I think it's affecting the other ones. Unfortunately, I made the terrible decision to try to fix this syncing problem by trying to get rid of syncing altogether. So I detached the phone and tablet variants from the primary desktop version. I mean, it did work, kind of, because I could now reorder the tablet elements without messing up the desktop nav, so I went ahead and was happily restyling the tablet and phone versions. I'm embarrassed to say this, but I was actually feeling really good at this point because I thought I was fixing the annoying problem that I'd been struggling with for the past several minutes. Woo! But in reality, I was creating a much larger problem of basically breaking the entire functionality of the breakpoint system. For the width, so here's a desktop, here's a tablet, is using a desktop design, and the phone. Okay. And while the desktop version looked great, the tablet and phone breakpoints were also loading the desktop version, which was definitely wrong. Why is it doing that? This is really driving me nuts. I decided to just take an L for now and break for dinner because I was pretty frustrated and hangry at this point and wasn't really getting anywhere. After dinner, I felt better and got back to the navigation. I realized that a big part of the problem was that I didn't fully understand how components and breakpoints worked together in Framer. So instead of trying to get the styles right, I needed to first focus on figuring out just how components and breakpoints work. And then once I had gained that understanding and had a working component, then I could safely move on to the styles. So I deleted everything to start from scratch with the original Framer navigation component. But this time, I would try to see how it was built and see if I could get the tablet version to display the hamburger menu instead of the desktop design. First, in the component view, I tried renaming the phone variant to Tablet and Tablet Open, and then increased the width to be 810 pixels. Then I duplicated both tablet variants and renamed the new ones to Phone and set the width to 390. And now with all 3 breakpoint variants created, I went back to the website view and tried adding the updated navigation component to the website. And it worked! Oh, they look good. Wow. I'm still not positive why, but I think naming the variants with tablet and phone and having them be the right width let Framer automatically load the correct variant for each breakpoint when you drag the component to the website. And since the breakpoints were functional now, I was able to start restyling the navigation once again to match the design. This time, updating the text styles and the layout definitely went quicker since I was a little more familiar with how things worked. I had a few hangups trying to work with the grid layout on tablet though. The height was really tall for some reason, even though I had set height of the top parent grid to fit already. But I did finally get everything sized when I discovered the advanced grid settings and set the height of the grid rows to be fit content instead of the default fill container. Then I was able to create the phone version by duplicating the tablet version and making it a smaller width. And the navigation is done. Getting to this point took 3.5 hours in real time, which felt like forever. A lot of it was getting used to how Framer works and the best way to build and size and align things. I was really hoping that the rest of the website build would go faster as I got better in Framer. The next section was the hero section, and before trying to build it, I decided to take a little extra time to save all the Figma text styles for the headlines and body text as saved styles in Framer. When I'm building from scratch, I'll save these types of global styles that keep reappearing throughout the website, so it's easier to reuse them later. I do really like how Framer lets you save text styles and even set different font sizes for different breakpoints, because once they're saved, you can quickly select whichever saved style you want right in the editor. Alright, I got all the saved text styles set up, and you can see them in the left sidebar. Next, I jumped into creating the hero section. I first added a text element, and added it to a new stack which I named Hero. And with Framer's syncing, the Hero stack was also automatically created for tablet and phone. I added a background fill color to the Hero stack, and then sized the width to be fill so that it would fill the container and go full width. Then I selected the pre-title saved style for the text to match the design. Added the H1 headline text, then duplicated it to create and style the paragraph text. Next, I created the CTA button by using the frame tool, then drawing a rectangle in the hero, and adding a text element to it. Then I added the orange background color and styled the text. Now, because there would be a lot of buttons on the website, I wanted to turn this into a component so that I could reuse it more easily. For the hover state, I first mistakenly created a whole new variant of the button. The variants are more for completely different versions of the button, like ones that have different colors. So what I did here was not correct. Thankfully, I did figure out that each variant already has the capability to have a hover or pressed state. So I created a hover version, deleted the incorrect variant, and then set the hover state color. And it looked pretty good. The hero text elements were looking good so far. Next, I needed to add in the hero image. So I put all the text elements into their own stack in order to keep them separate from the hero image. Then I created a new stack for the image, although to be honest, I could have created this as a frame. But at this point, I didn't quite understand that while stacks were Flexbox containers, frames were just elements and you could always turn them into layout stacks or grids later on. To add images, you can just drag the image file onto the website, but I've noticed that it doesn't quite get added exactly where you want it to go in the layers, so you might have to move it into the right place after you add it. After that, I absolutely positioned the image and made it 100% width in order to fill the container. Then to put the text on top of the image, I set its z-index to 2. And I left aligned it by setting align to start. One big difference that I noticed in how Framer does things differently than how I normally write styles deals with wrapper styles to limit the width and also center your content. In my styles, I will create a div with a wrapper class, set the max width to something like 1100 or 1200 pixels, and then center it inside its parent with the style rule margin inline auto. But in Framer, you can't set margins. They simply don't exist. So what I had to do was create a new stack called Hero Wrapper, set the max width to 1110 pixels, and put both the hero image and the hero text inside it. Then to center it, I had to go to its parent, the hero stack, and set the distribute setting, which is the justify content CSS property, to center. Then in order to get the image to go full height, I set the height of the hero wrapper to fit content and then added a minimum height. One thing I was starting to notice in Framer is that it uses Flexbox and Grid for everything. So to add space between elements, a lot of the times you'll need to put everything in a stack or grid and then use gap to add spacing between the children. Then if one element needs more space than the others, like the paragraph text here, you can add additional space for that element by putting it in yet another parent stack by itself, and then using padding to add the extra space. After adding the padding, I had to set the new stack's height to fit content instead of fixed, so that the paragraph text wouldn't get cut off. I found that I would get tripped up a lot when setting the height on elements. Framer seems to sometimes set height to a fixed pixel length, and I often found myself having to go back and change the height to fit in order to fit the content that was starting to get cut off. Building the tablet and phone versions of the hero section weren't as painful as before. Part of the reason was that a lot of the text styles were already set from my saved styles, so I just had to update the image of the headphones and adjust the gap and padding for each of the other breakpoints. Going into this next part, the categories section, I was starting to feel a little more familiar with Framer. I created a new section by using the rows stack tool and drawing the rectangle out on the page. Notice that it has a fixed height of 358 pixels based on what I drew. However, you can see in the layers sidebar that it got created outside the desktop breakpoint, so I had to drag it to desktop, which then automatically cloned the stack on tablet and phone too, which is pretty cool. I probably could have just created this as a regular frame first, not a stack, but I was still figuring things out, and I can always just delete the extra frame. The child frame was going to contain the 3 category blocks, so in the right sidebar, in the layout section, I made this into a horizontal stack. Then in the stack, I created a new child frame with the frame tool. Notice how it's immediately centered because the stack had distribute set to center by default. Next, to create this headphones block, I changed the fill color of the rectangle to light gray and created a new frame for the image. One quirk in Framer is that images are treated as fills. So I had to select fill, choose the image fill, and then choose the image file to get uploaded. In order to get the image to be above the gray rectangle, I set it to position absolute and then manually moved it up to have a negative top value. It was getting cropped off up at the top, but I was able to fix this by going into the fill settings and setting type, which sets the object fit property, to fit, which means contain in CSS speak. Next, I needed to get the gray block sized correctly. I'd set the gray background color on the parent category stack. The main element actually taking up space in the category was the original rectangle frame that had that fixed size, and I didn't need this anymore. So after I deleted it, the small headphones text was the only thing in the category actually taking up space, causing the parent and the gray background to shrink. The headphones image, if you remember, was absolutely positioned, so it was not in the flow of the document and wouldn't affect the size of the parent. Knowing about how absolutely positioned elements don't take up space on the page is a tricky aspect of CSS and something that even developers struggle with. So I can't even imagine how a non-coder would be able to understand what's going on and why the gray block suddenly shrank so much. Now back to the category stack. I changed the width to fill to take up all available space, and the height is set at fit content. It's really wide at this point, but it'll look better when we have the 2 other category blocks. Then I created a new stack and named it category wrapper. So this stack contains all the category content, kind of like what I did up in the hero with the hero wrapper stack containing all the hero content. And I set the max width of this wrapper to be 1110 pixels, again like the hero wrapper. I do wish that you could share styles like this max width setting by putting them in a CSS class and then putting that class on whatever element you want. But unfortunately, Framer does not use CSS classes. Next, I styled the H3 text to use one of the saved styles that I created earlier. And I started adding padding to the category stack to help increase the height of the gray block. Then I set overflow to visible so that the headphones image doesn't get cut off, but it's still getting cut off by the main categories stack at this point. So to solve this, I changed the height of the category stack from the fixed pixel height it had before to fit content. Then I added top and bottom padding, which created space so the headphones could show up. Next, I duplicated the headphones text for the shop link, created a new frame for the arrow icon, moved it after the shop text, and added the image by setting the fill image and selecting the arrow. The default setting for this is fill, which can skew images if the frame is different from the image itself, so I set object fit to contain it. Then I realized I needed to resize it to match the design anyway. Now, to get the shop text and arrow next to each other, I added both layers to a new stack, which I called CTA link. Then I set the direction of the stack to horizontal, which is the same thing as flex direction row. Since the shop text was supposed to be a link, I set it as a link just to the homepage. Then to style it, I renamed the existing link style to be link light. Then I duplicated it and named the copy link dark and added that darker text style. All right, now that the category styles were done, I duplicated the category block to get 3 total categories. And they lined up nicely since we had already made the parent a horizontal stack. Then I updated the images and the headline for the other categories, increased the gap space in the category wrapper, and tweaked the font size for the headlines. I had to change the width of the category stack to fill so that things would fit better on tablet and phone. And I also added some padding to the sides on tablet. Now for phone, there wasn't a ton that I had to do. Mainly, I changed the flex direction of the category wrapper stack to be vertical so that the categories would all stack to one column. And I also increased the gap space between the categories just to have a little more breathing room. And then I added padding on the left and right sides, just like we did in tablet. And there we have it, the categories on desktop, tablet, and mobile. Whew, okay, so that was much easier than the previous sections. I felt like I was starting to get the hang of Framer instead of feeling super frustrated all the time, so I jumped right into the next part, this product section with different blocks. I was getting more used to drawing frames to create new sections, although it always felt like I had to kind of wrangle it into the right place in the layers. This frame would contain all the products. I sized the width to be fill, which seems to be a good starting point. The height, I was still unsure about it, but I just kind of left it as fixed for now, and then I dragged the bottom edge down to increase the height. Then I created a new frame to contain the first product, setting its width to fill, and also setting a max width of 1110 pixels to match the widths of the other content on the site. In the product, I created a new frame and set the fill to image and added in the speaker image. I set the fill type to fit so the image wouldn't get cut off, and then manually sized the image to match the design. And then I set the height of the parent product stack to fit content so that it wouldn't crop out the image. Next was adding the orange background color, which I'd already saved, so thanks past me. This section also had this background of these circle lines, so I added the SVG as the background for another frame and sized it to be position absolute and 100% of the parent's width and height. Next, I started adding text to the section and was having some trouble trying to position the circle lines. But then I discovered something. I wonder if these fixed widths are in pixels or in rems. All this time, I had been setting sizes in pixel numbers, not thinking to wonder if they would be in pixels or rems on the final website. Framer lets you publish a live website for your project, so I decided to check the website to see what the final size for a random element would be. Oh no, it's set in pixels. That is very bad. Let's see what the text sizes are set at. Font size is 13 pixels. All right, why am I freaking out here about using pixels? Basically, it's an accessibility issue. You want users to be able to control the size of text on a website so they can decrease or increase the size to make reading easier. In your browser settings, the base font size is by default 16 pixels, meaning 1 rem, or root M unit, equals 16. Now, if we're on a website that uses rems for font size, like on Mozilla Developer Network, increasing your browser font size to, say, 22 pixels will then make 1 rem equal to 22 instead of 16. This will cause all the text on the site to increase as well. But on sites like my Framer site here, all the font sizes are in pixels. So changing what 1 rem is equal to in your settings is not going to have any effect. Now, I know you can zoom in on the browser too, but in my opinion, if there's a browser setting that exists, it's best practice to let that setting have an effect on the website. Now, to be fair, Framer is far from the only page builder that still uses pixels. In a quick comparison, Squarespace, Wix, and WordPress.com have all their font sizes in pixels too. The only exception I found was Webflow, which does allow you to use rems. So I know that Framer is still very new, and they are taking feedback from the community into account, one request which is to add relative units like rems. It has been moved into the considered category, which is awesome. So hopefully it'll happen soon. Alright, so rems and pixels aside, I got back to building the product section. The main problem that I had was figuring out how to position the speaker image and the circle lines in the right place. In the Figma design, the speaker is kind of centered over the circles. The background lines I had positioned absolutely and pinned it to the left and top sides, and then slightly off screen in both directions using negative values. I do really like this little visual diagram with the top, right, bottom, and left values, and then letting you choose which sides to pin, meaning their style rules would take effect. So since the lines were positioned absolute, I decided to do the same thing to the speaker, and then I pinned it to the left and bottom sides so that it would be in the right place even if the viewport width changed. Then I brought back the text, which I'd hidden while working on the circle lines and speaker. And I adjusted the parent product stack to be distribute or justify content end to make that text block aligned on the right edge. Next, I copied and pasted the paragraph text and made it the body copy style and the right color. Then I created a new button variant with a black background color and a gray hover state. I do really like how easy it is to create new variants once you have the main component built out. And back on the website, I could drag the button component from the Assets sidebar to the product block and then choose a correct variant, dark button. To align the button to the left, I first tried to change the distribute value because I forgot that the flex direction was vertical. But then, when I remembered, I set the align items to start to align everything on the cross axis horizontally. And to add space between the text elements, I increased the gap to 24 pixels. Now, I needed more space under the paragraph to the button. Unfortunately, in CSS, you can only have one gap value. But a good workaround was to add the paragraph to a new stack and then add the additional space with some bottom padding. Lastly, I added some right padding and set a max width on the product text block so that it would match the design width. With desktop done now, I looked at the Figma design for tablet and mobile. And the main changes would be putting the speaker and text in one column on top of each other and adjusting that circle lines background. So in Framer, I changed the speaker image to be position relative, and then in the parent product stack, I changed the flex direction to be vertical to stack the image and text. And I increased the gap to add space between them. I also noticed a weird quirk in Framer when I was trying to set the height of the speaker image. When I set the height to something not fixed, I got an alert saying that the parent has been set to a fixed height so that it doesn't collapse. And then on the parent, when I changed its height to fit content, I didn't get an alert, but when I went back to the speaker image, you can see that the height has now been changed to a fixed height. It is a bit weird because in CSS, I will usually set my images to have a height of auto. But auto is not really an option in Framer, so I think the best way forward is to have a fixed width and height for the images, and then let the parent's height be fit content. Next, I had to center the text and the button, so I set align to center, which centered the button within the stack. And then I set text align to center for the headline. Now I also tried centering the paragraph text, but you can see that there's nothing changing. Turns out there's this weird bug in Firefox and Framer where changing text styles oftentimes does not get reflected on the website. And the only thing I can really do is to have Framer also open in Chrome and then make that change in Chrome. And then go back to Firefox where the paragraph text is now centered. Now the text still wasn't centered within the block, which was kind of throwing me for a loop. But I did finally figure out that I had padding right of 95 pixels on the product text stack. So getting rid of that made everything look good. Then I added some top and bottom padding for breathing room and moved the circle lines into the right position. And now in preview mode, things are looking good on tablet. Now for the phone version. To start, it still had the desktop styles, so that's why it looks kind of messed up right now. Framer's supposed to let you copy and paste styles between layers, so I wanted to copy the tablet styles into the phone version to have a better starting point. But for some reason, all the copy options were grayed out. I'm not sure, but I think this might be a bug because I tried again later on, and the options were enabled that time, so I'm not really sure what's going on. We'll just have to remake it manually, which is fine. So again, I changed the flex direction of the product stack to be vertical, then changed the speaker from position absolute to relative, got the pixel size of the image from Figma, and updated the width and height to be fixed and to match the design. Next, I set the text block to have a width of fill, set align to be center, and got rid of that right padding once again. Then I centered the headline text, and I did have to use Chrome again to center the paragraph. Then I added padding on the product stack, and increased the gap to add space under the speaker image, and then drag the circle lines image up into the right position. Now I realized that I forgot to add padding on either side of the orange product block on tablet, so I added padding there and also added it for the phone version. Alright, things are looking pretty good on the preview site. I'm skipping over the next sections here because they were pretty straightforward.
6.5 hours later.
Now going into the last section of the website, the footer, I did feel a lot more confident in my Framer skills compared with how I felt at the beginning of this website build. I had a general idea of the right approach by now, and the Framer quirks that had tripped me up so much in the beginning didn't seem as impossible anymore. So I decided to do everything in stages. First, I would create frames for each footer element or group, and then I would add the text or image content for each frame, and lastly, I would work on the sizing and layout. Looking at the Figma design on desktop, the content was in 2 columns. On tablet, it was 1 column for most of it, and 2 columns at the very bottom. And on mobile, everything was in 1 column and also centered. So to me, this looked like a good case to use grid for the layout. In Framer, once again, I used the F key to select the frame tool, and then I drew out the new frame and renamed it. Then I added a fill color for the background to be black, and set the width to fill. The next step was to create all the footer elements and get the text and image content all set. So I created frames for the elements, the orange line up at the top, the logo image, the footer links, the paragraph text, the copyright text, and the social media links. And now to start adding the actual content in each frame. For the line, I adjusted the height and width to match the design, and then set the orange background color. Next up was a logo, so I added a fill and selected image fill, and then uploaded the logo image file. And I set the type to fit, which sets object fit contain. I checked the design to get the correct size, and then set the width and height to match it in Framer. Next was the links. I initially was trying to see if I could copy the styles from the existing navigation component, but for whatever reason, all the copy style commands were disabled and I couldn't figure it out. So in the interest of just getting stuff done, I got my text tool out and started remaking them from scratch, starting with the home link. I made the first one a link, linked it to just the current page, made the style link light, got rid of the default white background in the parent so links would show up, and adjusted the size and letter spacing. Unfortunately, I ran into the Firefox text bug yet again. The transform uppercase was not taking effect, and toggling the controls didn't do anything. So I had to go back to Chrome to make all of this work. Next, I set the width and height to be fit content, and then I duplicated it to make the other 3 links, updated the text for each of them, and made the parent links frame into a stack. I put the links into the correct order and made them all bold. Then I spaced them out with some more gap and set the width and height of the parent links to fit content. Then I dragged them approximately to the right place just for now. Next up, I copied the paragraph text from the design, added a text layer, and pasted in the copy. All the text got pasted into one giant long line because the default width of the text layer is fit. I kind of wish that Framer would make the default width fill instead, so that the text would wrap automatically, just to be more intuitive. Then I added in the text styles and set the color. But to get the text to show up, I had to remove the white fill color from the parent. And I set its width to relative and 40% just for now, and set the child text layer's width to fill. Next up, I copied the copyright text from a design, duplicated the paragraph element in Framer, and pasted in the copyright copy. After renaming the stack, I deleted the original copyright frame that I didn't need anymore. And now we were on the last part of the footer, the social media icons. Initially, I thought this was going to be easy. Just add in the SVG icons and change the fill color of the SVG path to orange on hover. Easy, right? So I started with my usual approach, drawing a new frame for the first icon for Facebook, and then setting the fill to image and uploading the Facebook SVG. But then I realized that I needed to figure out how to add the orange hover state. I remembered setting hover state colors for other links on the site, so I tried to do the same thing here by making it a link. But I couldn't find any control where I could change the color of the SVG on hover. I decided to check the other links in the navigation component, and here I could see the link style had a hover section where you could change the color. But then I went back to the Facebook icon and realized that I'd uploaded it as an image, not an inline SVG, so of course I couldn't change the SVG color this way. So I tried just dragging the SVG file directly onto the website to see if it did anything different, but I couldn't find anything in Framer that would let me control the color of the SVG. So I tried looking at some of those pre-made components that had shapes and even vector paths, but I did not find anything that was similar to what I was looking for with the hover states. However, while searching in Framer, I finally found what I needed: icons. They've integrated some icon libraries so that you can insert pretty much any icon that you need onto your website. So I dragged the material icons onto the website, and it created a new material component. The cool part was that it had this special material section in the right sidebar, so I could select the name of the icon that I wanted, in my case, Facebook. And even better, I could control the color right here too. So I deleted all the other icon attempts to focus on getting this working with the material icons. Now, in order to get the color to change on hover, I realized that I needed to create a component for these icons because that's the only way that I can set up the interactive part of this in Framer. So now that I knew a little bit more about components, I created the hover state and set that color to orange. And when I previewed, the hover state did work, which was awesome. However, I wanted to add a transition animation to the color change so that it would fade from white to orange more smoothly. But even though the transition settings were active, the color change was not getting affected. I posted my question in the Framer support community, which is a great place to find help, and the Framer team as well as other users are generally pretty quick to respond. Unfortunately, at the moment, you cannot transition the color in any of these icons without using a hack, but who knows, maybe they'll add in that functionality at some point. For now, I decided to just move forward, and I created the other social media icons as variants, along with their hover states. Now with the components and variants created, back on the website, I added the Facebook icon to a stack, and then duplicated it for the other two icons. Then I made it into a horizontal stack and adjusted the size so that they would be next to each other. Then I selected the correct variant for the other two icons, and there you have it. So now I had all the footer elements set up and styled. The last thing I had to do was to get them into the correct layout to match the design. I wanted to use grid for the footer layout, so on the parent footer frame, I added a layout and selected grid. And this automatically created a grid template of 2 columns and 3 rows. Now, things looked pretty weird at first. So the first thing I had to do was put the children into the right order in the footer layer because they're all basically auto-placed by Framer. Now, unfortunately, you can't explicitly set the child's placement like you can with the CSS grid row and grid column properties. So things still looked kind of weird, but at least all the footer elements were now in the right order. Next, I had to set how many columns and rows each child would span. Starting with the orange line, I set it to span all the columns in the grid, so it would take up 100% of the row. Then I went back to Figma to get the actual size of a line element, and then in Framer, I set the width and height to be fixed and match that size. And that's much better. Next was a logo, which was really huge right now, so I got the correct size from Figma and set the width and height to be fixed. On desktop, the copyright text comes after the social media icons, so I moved them into the right order. Now everything for the desktop version was in the right order and placement in the grid. But the whole footer looked super tall, so I went into the advanced grid settings, since I knew about them now, and set the height of the grid to fit content instead of stretching to fill. Now, removing the stretching made everything shoved together to the top, so I needed to add space between all the footer elements, starting with this space under the line. First, I tried adding the space by adding bottom padding to the line itself, but I forgot that because the line was the entire element, adding padding only increased the overall height of the orange line. So since there's no margin in Framer like I've mentioned before, I had to add the line to a new stack and then add bottom padding to the stack instead of the line itself. Now, creating the new stack messed up the grid placement because the stack was the direct grid child now, so I had to re-add the spanning all columns setting to the stack. Now at the moment, all the footer content was going all the way out to the side edges. I wanted to limit the max width of the footer content, so I put everything into a new stack. Then I renamed the old footer to footer content and the new parent to footer. Then I set the correct background color on the parent, and in the footer content added a max width of 1110 pixels. And now the footer content wasn't going all the way out to the sides, but was centered within that max width. Now, continuing to add space between footer elements, I added top and bottom padding to the paragraph tag to add space above and below it. And I also needed to make the social media icons line up with the bottom of the paragraph, so I added a bottom padding there to match what I'd set on the paragraph, and set the width to fit content. Then to get rid of that extra space at the bottom of the footer, I changed the overall footer content height to fit, and then added a bit of bottom padding to match the design. And overall, the footer was looking good. And my approach of the proper steps to follow in Framer seemed to be working too, creating a frame for each element, adding the text or image content, sizing each of them, and then doing the layout and spacing last. Now with desktop done, next up was the tablet version. The biggest differences for tablet were that most of the content was in one column, except for the last row which contained the copyright text and social media icons. And the icons were last on tablet as opposed to the copyright being last on desktop. So the first thing I did was change the grid layout to one column. And you might notice that when I did this, Framer automatically changed the number of rows to 6 because there are 6 child layers in the footer content. So with the grid updated, next was placing the grid children in the correct placement. The line was fine because it was already spanning all columns, but I had to do the same thing with the logo so that it would go all the way across. The links I also set to span all columns, and to get it left aligned, I had to tweak that position diagram so that it was justified to the left instead of to the right or center. And the paragraph seemed fine, but I set it to span all columns as well, just for good measure. And I realized at this point that I actually needed 2 columns in the grid template for the copyright and social media icons. And I did kind of mess up this part because I mistakenly thought that Framer would sync the order of all the layers across all the different breakpoints, desktop, tablet, and mobile, which is not the case. It will sync an order change that you make on desktop to the tablet and mobile breakpoints because desktop is considered the primary. But any order change that you make on the non-primary breakpoints will not affect any other ones. But I didn't realize that slight difference, so what I did instead was duplicate the copyright layer so that there would be 2 copies for all breakpoints, but have one version before the social media icons and one after. And then I just hid whichever one I didn't need on that breakpoint. Now this did work, but it was definitely not the most efficient solution. So after that, all the footer content was in the correct place in the grid, so next up was getting the tablet spacing set. So I adjusted the padding of the overall footer to match the design, and then got rid of the padding on the social media icons, and added some more padding below the paragraph, as well as adding padding on top of the navigation links. I also tweaked the padding under that line. So here's a tablet footer design, and here's the website, and they look pretty close to me. Alright, last up is the mobile design. Here everything is in one column, including the navigation links, and everything is centered, even that orange line. So I started by changing the grid template to just be one column with 6 rows. And then for the footer elements, just going from the top down, I centered the line by adjusting the justify and align self properties in that position diagram, then adjusted the spacing under the line. And for the logo, I set this span to be all columns, which was unnecessary since the grid template was already just one column. Then I centered it in the grid cell. One feature that I really wish Framer had was to allow you to show the grid lines, because it would really help to see where everything is in the template just to make things easier. Next up was the link stack. I changed the direction to be vertical, and then centered them with that position diagram again. I really like that diagram. It honestly might be my favorite Framer feature. Then I updated the gap spacing between the links and added some padding on the top and bottom. Then for the paragraph, I tweaked the padding there too. Unfortunately, I couldn't set text line centered due to that Firefox bug, so once again, I used my usual Chrome workaround. Next up was the copyright text, which I dragged up before the social media icons. And here I was checking to see if this change affected the other breakpoints, which it didn't. And again, I couldn't center it in Firefox, so had to use Chrome. And the last part was the social media icons, which I centered with the position diagram. And then adjusted the padding for the stack. I also added padding for the footer content to add space on the left and the right. And the very last thing, I removed that extra white space at the bottom of the website. And then it was time to hit publish and check out the live site. And here's the finished site. I think it looks pretty good. I was able to match the design, and Framer takes care of the responsiveness, so I didn't have to worry about writing styles and media queries and all that jazz. One thing that I don't really love is that when you hit a breakpoint, Framer basically reloads the parts of the site using React. And when it refreshes, you can see there's a bit of a content shift, mainly from the images. Normally, you could prevent this by adding width and height attributes to the HTML image tag. However, the way Framer works, I don't think it would prevent the content shift because it's dynamically refreshing everything. Now, I'm not a React expert, so I might not be 100% correct on this, but it is what I observed in the DevTools inspector. Alright, so the website is finished. In total, the whole thing took 14 hours. But I think that's not too bad, especially as I was learning Framer as I went along. And I bet that if I tried again, I could build a website in less than a day. So, what are my thoughts on Framer as a tool to build websites? Overall, I do think that Framer is a good tool for what it is. It's not the same as writing custom code where you have complete control over how the site looks and you can use every CSS property that you want. In order to be user-friendly, especially for non-developers, Framer lets you have control over certain aspects of the layout and appearance of the website. And this is the trade-off. You don't have complete control, but in return for using Framer, you can build responsive websites potentially very quickly and without having to write any CSS. I think that Framer's strengths are that it has a nice UI that's pretty clean and fairly intuitive. It's very similar to Figma's UI, so if you're already familiar with Figma, then you'll have a bit of a head start if you want to get into Framer. Features that I really like are the components that you can use to create different versions of things like buttons and easily reuse them. And they have a decent collection of pre-made components that you can drag and drop onto your website. I also like that breakpoint system where you can create different versions of the website for desktop, tablet, and mobile, and then Framer will automatically load the correct version. And I do think that Framer has adapted CSS layout styles in a really neat way, letting you set what ultimately become Flexbox and grid style rules with the controls. Now, in terms of cons, the biggest one in my book is that Framer uses pixels for all its sizing, which is really not best practice for accessibility, especially for font size. I'm hoping that they'll change this in the future, even just giving the user the option to use rems or other units. The other cons are probably more due to being a fairly new product on the market. It is slightly buggy sometimes, like how text changes don't work in Firefox, but I didn't encounter enough bugs to the level that it was really annoying. And it does seem like the dev team in Framer is continually working on improving the product with bug fixes and features. The other big con is that there's no in-depth documentation. Framer just has very broad blog posts that give you a general idea of the different features in Framer, but there are no detailed docs at the moment, which can make learning Framer a lot harder and more frustrating. However, there are options for support in the meantime. There is a Framer community for support, like I've said, and the Framer team seems pretty responsive. I also found some really helpful YouTube tutorials on the Flux Academy and Framer's own YouTube channel. So the big question in all this is, would I recommend Framer as a good option to create a website? As always, the answer is, it depends. I think Framer actually would be good if you're just making a fairly simple website for things like small businesses, or even a simple blog where you're just creating image and text content online. I don't think Framer would be good if you need to build a complex web app or e-commerce solution. And while they do have CMS capability, from what I've heard, it's a little more basic than what's possible with dedicated CMS products. I do think Framer is worth at least checking out and seeing how much you like or dislike it as a tool. Once you get more familiar with it, it's actually pretty fun to use. And like I said, they are a new product and are continually making changes and improvements to the tool, which is encouraging. But please, Framer, just give us REMS.